Hello, this is Dr. J, and you are watching a lecture about corruption. Specifically, I'll be talking about corruption in Brazil today. There are many ways you can talk about corruption. You can talk about it in specific social and cultural contexts. And focusing on Brazil is just one way to talk about it, but this is a global phenomenon. This is something that has existed as long as politics and governments and powerful people have existed. We've seen forms of corruption. Corruption, then, is a cultural concept, it is a global universal, and it is also something that is very specific to local context. We can dissect it, we can see and look and examine the histories. There's many different ways to represent corruption. In this lecture today, I will be using a lot of political cartoons. These are mass media, mass produced, meant for the masses, for people to consume and critique those who are in power. The specific image that I have in front of you today is depicting the Emperor of Brazil receiving noble people from Brazil. There's praise being bestowed upon him, and he is most likely receiving favors and handing out favors that are not necessarily transparently seen by the broader public at the time. You can see some examples across the world. Once again, this is a global concept. This is a map in front of you made by Transparency International. They're an NGO, non-governmental organization that looks at transparency throughout the world. It's very subjective to measure corruption. There are different ideas of deviance and criminality and different ideas of how a state should normally function, what it means to have a rule of law. So, before I go any further, I'd like to introduce the term cultural relativity to think about this idea of corruption, deviance, and the rule of law. We have to ground our knowledge of corruption and deviance and the rule of law in cultural contexts. We need to see that there is specific perspectives and ways of seeing the world that are unique to different countries and different people and different communities. And as we assess this, we're going to maybe run into some of our biases about how other countries and other people interact with institutions. We want to sort of reserve those. We don't want to let those biases and those prejudices overwhelm our discussion of corruption. Instead, I'm going to see this as, once again, a global phenomenon that happens in various degrees. We break down this map, we see Brazil is pretty dark in color in terms of being a highly corrupt. We see that the Western world and Europe and Australia and the United States is seen as less corrupt in this map. We'll talk about some forms and different various ways to measure corruption in terms of theft and specific ways individuals abuse their authority. I'd like to think that there are people in places such as Afghanistan that probably think that the United States is very corrupt, that probably think that the Western world and Western Europe is very corrupt, much more than their own society, for culturally specific and culturally biased reasons. So we'll explore some of those. We'll look at Brazil and really engage some of the key concepts of corruption that take place in Brazil, Latin America, and then we'll try to apply that a little bit throughout the world as well. One article we can refer to, and this is something that I'll be linking to, is an article by Donna Goldstein and Kristen Drybread. They talk about the social life of corruption in Latin America and get together a bunch of different articles and authors to describe corruption in various countries in Latin America, not just Brazil. They give some examples in this short essay. They talk about the Panama Papers, which was something that was really prominent, a story that was really prominent in the 2010s. More or less, it was a money laundering scheme producing shell corporations for wealthy people to get bribes, put them into bank accounts in small little countries in the Caribbean that had very loose oversight and loose transparency when it came to negotiating with the bank system, and then moving that around so it becomes impossible to know where the money came from and where it's going, who owns the money. And it creates a huge lack of oversight and a great deal of problems for individuals and institutions that like to present themselves as democratic. They also talk about Paul Manafort, which is an interesting case, something that's very relevant to the United States and the United States international presence, interacting with other types of democracies and other types of governments. Paul Manafort was the one-time campaign manager of Donald Trump in earlier stages in his campaign. He was also the campaign manager for a Ukrainian dictator that was overthrown, and it was discovered through various investigations that were carried out by the FBI and other investigatory institutions in the United States that Paul Manafort was getting money from various foreign actors and then laundering that money through various real estate investments and by hiding it and not declaring it in other ways. So he ended up going to jail for doing those things. Both forms of political corruption, these people that were very highly connected to wealth and authority and power, and the Panama Papers brought down a number of governments and implicated a number of politicians, presidents throughout the world. All of these were very important events that had significant influences on our ways we see democracy and transparency. Beyond these two examples, we see that Donna Goldstein and Kristen Drybread are trying to articulate a theoretical perspective on how to talk about corruption. They argue that you need to look at rationalities, so the way things are made logical and how they're made sense on the ground. Moralities, how people negotiate what's right and wrong, things that should be done and things that are done. And then we can see the practices, so the methods, the specific social interactions that get created by breaking rules, bending rules, shifting moralities, shifting rationalities. Once again, we can look at the idea of cultural relativity. Both Goldstein and Drybread are anthropologists, so they are very much interested in suspending, to some extent, cultural biases and looking at unique cultural contexts. But also, we can see in a broader context, in terms of global corruption, the idea that white-collar crime committed by already powerful, already wealthy people, becomes normalized in many different ways and in many different contexts. And we can ask how this happens, why this happens, and what it produces in the end. Taking a step back and thinking about sociology and anthropology in general, we can look at the idea of the state. Who controls the state? Who is representative of the state? How the state gets used. I'll refer to the German philosopher Max Weber to build on this idea of the state. You can talk about it in many different ways, but Weber was looking specifically at the 19th and 20th century industrial age, the age of modernity, something that was shifting away from the Renaissance and something that was shifting into a different type of modern global society, one that was governed by democracy and science and forms of representation capitalism that had not necessarily defined Europe or other parts of the world up until Weber's writing. He uses the term, and this is a very noteworthy term, the monopoly of the legitimate use of force. That is the principal power of the state, to monopolize how force and authority is used. I'll point towards this cartoon on the screen. It is depicting the protests in Ferguson, Missouri that took place in 2014. We can see on one side a highly militarized police force that is threatening to use violence against individuals who are protesting relatively peacefully the oppression of African American individuals by the police. So we see that one side feels justified in using large degrees of militarized force. These individuals represent the state. They are the police. They're the principal representatives of the state interacting with the everyday individual. And then we see the everyday individual who is a justifiable target of the state and the police if they act out, if they leave the normalized relationship between the powerful and the less powerful. Weber also looks at a specific political class beyond the police and beyond the bureaucratic institutions of the state. This political class are individuals that have politics as a vocation. This works beyond political ideology. We can think about the individuals who run campaigns, the individuals who run cabinets and organize politicians, who write bills, who articulate policy. A lot of times, these individuals aren't defining policy and political interactions based off their own individual politics, but instead have been trained and are highly specialized to participate in politics, to facilitate politicians, to facilitate individuals with different political ideologies. So we have the difference between individuals who live for politics. I would say that these would be the politicians, political candidates, and then the people who live off of politics, those people who are behind the scenes, that run political machines, that run political bureaucracies. These are complex mechanism of the state. This is a number of individuals interacting and negotiating, shifting around power and authority, and who gets to control and leverage that monopoly of the legitimate use of force. Deviance, then, is when that state determines that you are non-normative, that you have to be treated differently because you are leaving the idea of normativity, what is allowed, what is expected, what is implicit as a valued and moral and rational individual. I'll point to the cartoons and the pictures on the screen. We have one on the left that is depicting a automatic rifle against the head of a child that is supposed to represent a favela child, a child from the favela playing soccer, innocent child, of course, someone who is not necessarily even capable of committing a crime because they are so young. And then you see someone who represents the state, o Estado, which is written there on the shirt, on the sports coat of the individual. That individual standing behind a wall, protected, authoritative, has modern buildings behind them, so representing power and authority and wealth. And we see that there's a dynamic that these individuals who have power and authority often like to marginalize those individuals who are already marginalized, like to see poor individuals, likes to see individuals who lack political power, people who experience racial difference, likes to see those individuals treated as less than human or less entitled to human and political rights as other individuals. So the Brazilian favela, the Brazilian shantytown is just one example. We can see in the US criminal justice system something that's very similar, where corporate individuals, individuals who represent money and who represent business power, are often let off the hook. They don't have to face personal responsibility. They often have to restructure their business. They often have to go through a bureaucratic and legal process, but those individuals aren't determined to be deviants. They might have broken regulations and incurred fines, but they are not necessarily considered deviants. Whereas, and this is a debate that we are having, evolving right now in our modern society, the discussion of drugs, illegal narcotics, using pot or marijuana, for example, can levy some pretty heavy fines and heavy consequences if you are sentenced in front of a judge. And this could either be in the possession or the use of, or even being stigmatized, being associated with individuals that are using drugs. There's some places where you are not even allowed to associate with individuals who possess drugs, right? So there is a different degree of responsibility for individuals who might be committing petty crimes related to personal drug use or personal and small level drug sales, compared to the millionaire who is damaging a whole society. This is a context we can see, despite political perspective, that there is a conversation constantly evolving where the big guy is winning, the little guy often gets the harsh and most severe aspects of the legal system. We can see this in terms of the rule of law. Then how do we mediate all this? How do we allow the state to continue to justify their use of force and their use of the legal system to oppress individuals? Individuals in power are able to have an ideology that claims a form of normalcy, that they are there to enforce the law, that they are individuals who are maintaining the rationality and the impartiality of the law. I have two images here on the screen, one of Trump and one of Obama, just to not be too politically biased here. They're rather innocuous. They don't say anything about a political statement, really. It's just saying that these people in power like to choose the rule of law that suits them. They like to idealize specific aspects of the law, enforce specific aspects of the law, but often they oppose the laws or they contradict the laws that apply most specifically to them. And this has to do with corruption. This has to do with the restraints on the limited use of force, the legitimate use of force. So translating this slightly, we can see that the rule of law is another way to say a normalcy for the law, a respect for the law, a legal order without the need for enforcement. So something that is embedded in individuals, something that individuals internalize. They respect the law because it is a moral and ethical institution. This is, of course, not a pure concept, not a pure social fact that we can see. The rule of law is a cultural ideal. It is something that's often claimed, but is rarely achieved. It's something that's always being challenged by various aspects of society, and it's a respect for the law beyond anything other than a concrete fact. Opposing the rule of law, then, we have the idea of law and order, which is translated slightly, something that is a little more tough on crime, something that is using that force that the state is able to use and legitimize and leverage. And this contrasts slightly with the rule of law because the rule of law is tacit. It's often unspoken. It's something that individuals internalize, whereas law and order tactics in policing and use of the state are physical. It causes death. It causes violence. It attacks and physically harms deviants. It incarcerates people in mass incarceration. And it also limits human rights. So it's anti-human rights at times. It suspends human rights for the sake of guaranteeing the law. So it suspends that right to live healthy for the sake of the law. One really good example of this is Jair Bolsonaro, the current president of Brazil. I'd like to point towards the sign that he's doing on the screen, this gun sign, this sort of thumb up, index finger out, pointed at things like the fawns or something like that. Some very weird, cool-ish gesture that is meant to represent a gun. It's meant to represent a firearm. And Jair Bolsonaro is someone who is very much a law and order president. He is someone who has ran a political campaign and organized a political coalition and mobilized powers of the state to get tough on crime. What has this resulted in? It's resulted in an increased use of force by police officers, the increased number of deaths of both innocent individuals and people suspected of criminal activity. And it's also allowed for tougher laws and mass incarceration to be put on the board, on the chessboard, as a political mechanism that the government is pushing forward. It's also entered into somewhat of a cultural condition, this index finger gun being pointed. Just looking at these pictures really quickly, on the top left, we see him at Jair Bolsonaro next to his wife at the inauguration, and he's pointing at some of his supporters. He's in the Senate in the picture next to him. He's pointing at some of his supporters there, looking pretty happy. On the middle left, we see him in the hospital This was immediately after he got stabbed and went to the hospital. Some man who was mentally ill tried to kill him at a campaign rally. He got stabbed in the gut, went to the hospital. Here he is to show his supporters that he is okay and he's going to follow through on his promises. He's doing the gun sign. So, a victim of violence looking to use this image of violence and law and order to project confidence and demonstrate his political ideology. We see in another image next to that, he is using a tripod, and in this video I've posted to it, he is discussing how he would use this tripod as a machine gun to kill his political enemies. And he specifically mentions the socialist government of Brazil that he was running against, or a candidate at least from the socialist parties that he was running against. And he more or less was advocating violence as a way to clamp down and create a more orderly society. He was accusing his political rival of corruption as well. And he was also accusing them of crimes, their own forms of violence. In the lower left-hand corner of this image matrix, we have one of Bolsonaro's sons surrounded by guns. He is a federal police officer. He's got all these guns, weapons. The average person isn't necessarily allowed to have these big automatic weapons in Brazil, unlike the United States, where people can have these big guns. In Brazil, it's a lot more controlled. This guy is more or less showing his affinity for the gun, his affinity for using law and order as a mechanism to secure and control and progress Brazil's state. And then we have another image in the bottom right corner. This is something I've posted to as well. Jair Bolsonaro picks up a toddler. She looks like she's 1 or 2 years old and forces the shape of this toddler's hand into the pointed gun symbol. And there's a video of this that I posted to. It is a ridiculous thing to see some person advocating a child to use this sign of law and order, this violent symbol. It's just a bizarre thing to see, something that's very culturally specific, something that was very frequently and widely viewed in Brazil and used by opponents as an example of Jair Bolsonaro's failure to secure human rights, failure to secure the rights of criminals or people accused of a crime. And I also wanted to point towards one specific phrase that really symbolizes this in Brazil, something that Jair Bolsonaro has said and his supporters are definitively in support of, and this is the idea of the bandido bom e bandido morto, or a good bandit is a dead bandit, a good criminal is a dead criminal. And this is something that has really been profuse and widespread in Brazil for generations, but it is something that in this current political moment is helping to orient some of the political forces in the Brazilian state. In critique of this law and order motif that Jair Bolsonaro is supporting, there's been a lot of backlash. We can imagine that there is a lot of political opposition and social opposition to individuals using violence to achieve a political goal. This is probably one of the most compelling images. This image on the screen, it is a flyer for the Dead Kennedys. They are a old school punk band that's really anti-establishment, anti-violence. A Brazilian artist was given the responsibility to make the tour poster for the Dead Kennedys when they visited Brazil on their 40th year reunion or 40th anniversary of their first time in Brazil. And we can see that it is also a very bizarre and ridiculous image. There's a nickname, so a little background for this. There's a nickname for Jair Bolsonaro. They call them bozos, Bolsonaro bozo. And we see here there is a nuclear family, all dressed in Brazil's national colors, so law and order often is associated with nationalism and populism. They all have guns. They're all dressed like clowns, like a bozo. And they're surrounded by a burning favela with tanks shooting out dollar signs. Wonderful image to critique someone if you're against law and order policies. So that brings me to just a general idea of corruption then. So we have the idea of the state, we have the idea of law and order, we have the idea of rule of law, how the state should be run, the morals and ethics and philosophies that should drive it, and the individuals who are responsible for driving those philosophies. When that goes wrong internally, we often call it corruption. Those are both goods and deeds. So you can have corruption in the form of money, in the form of things changing hands when they shouldn't be, and also deeds changing hands when they shouldn't be. This could be money, this could be pension funds getting allocated, public resources getting allocated in the wrong way. We can also have vehicles and buildings. This is something we see a lot in countries where individuals sell buildings for a much lower price than what they're worth. And this ends up being something that makes money for the individual who's receiving it. Let me get into some examples of corruption in Brazil now. In the postmodern state in Brazil, we see that there's a huge influence of neoliberal capitalism. So this idea of global international capitalism going around. The idea of democracy is important. So we see Brazil constantly critiquing exploitation based off of democratic ideals, participatory and inclusionary ideals. We see that industrialization, mass exploitation of resources is very important. And then the information society, so the internet and social media, that has a huge impact on how Brazilians and people across the globe are processing the idea of corruption. The first example I will point to is Eike Batista. For a time, Eike Batista thought he was going to be the wealthiest man in the world. He was making a whole bunch of money off of oil and selling futures for gold and other resources. And he was getting all this speculative neoliberal capital invested in Brazil. This gave him a huge degree of wealth, a huge degree of popularity among Brazil's entrepreneurs and business sector. This was in the 2000s and the 2010s when Brazil was going through a huge economic boom. And he became one of the most wealthy, visible people in Brazil. During this time, we see that he is accumulating massive amounts of wealth. We have a picture on the screen of him laughing in his mansion in Jardins, Rio de Janeiro, Jardim Botânico, Rio de Janeiro. So this very posh, wealthy neighborhood, privileged neighborhood. They tore down all the favelas, all the shanty towns in the 1960s, and they helped build mansions and the botanical garden and other important resources for the wealthy and for the elite. Eike Batista is so wealthy and so powerful, he can park his Mercedes McLaren SLR, a $750,000 car, in his living room. And he flaunts this. This is abstract wealth, we can imagine. The wealthiest man in Brazil gets to park a nearly $800,000 car in his mansion. Okay, this is the world, this is capitalism, this is something that is expected. We all know examples of abstract wealth. Doesn't make him a criminal, doesn't make him a deviant. In fact, it makes him the exact opposite. He makes him a man to be praised and a man to hold up as an example of what could be good in Brazil. Let's look below the surface. There's some very scandalous issues about Eike Batista. If we look at his history, there is some examples of him ordering people to get killed in gold mines when he was younger, in his 30s. He had a very playboy lifestyle. He actually married a playboy playmate and had this very bizarre social media tabloid career before he was the wealthiest person in Brazil. And then once again, all his wealth was speculative. He was very much involved in politics at the federal and local level in Rio de Janeiro. He helped finance some very problematic policing programs, pacification project that removed drug gangs, and also was used to reshape the city for the World Cup and the Olympics. And he also appeared to be paying some bribes, but that was not really his downfall. His downfall was really over speculation. He overinflated the value of his mineral futures. Okay, so he's sort of getting on the way out. This is 2015, 2016. His son, 18-year-old son, Thor Batista, takes out that McLaren one night and hits a guy riding his bicycle on a back road. You see here in the bottom left-hand side that the $750,000 Mercedes is pretty trashed. They'll fix it. It's not worth $750,000 anymore. And that seems like something that is the principal concern for Eike Batista and Thor, because even though this bicycle rider died, Thor is allowed to stay out of jail. He gets to have high-priced lawyers, and eventually he gets let off with a slap on the wrists, moves to Aspen, Colorado, and starts a fitness career and gets off the hook. So he negligently kills someone and he gets off the hook. Many people associated this with his wealth and his privilege. Some individuals called it institutional corruption, that Eike Batista, over his lifetime, had accumulated so many political and economic and governmental favors that the judge was inclined to give him and his family some lenience. Nothing illegal necessarily, but we can see this as something that's morally contentious, something that's ethically contentious, and something that is unjust. Someone died and other people got off the hook. Going and looking at the history of corruption in Brazil, this isn't the only time that Brazil's had corruption, or the only time in the history of the world that we can see corruption. In the United States, Europe, all other countries in the world have had a form of corruption as long as there has been state-level governments. So going back to the ancient Egyptians, there has been corruption. Just here, we can see some examples of political cartoons critiquing corruption. Up in the upper left-hand corner, we have the Emperor of Brazil looking like a six-armed monster, just taking different satchels and different forms of wealth and different purses from different individuals, holding them around, being worshipped almost as a god. People were seeing the empire, the monarchy, as a form of corruption. Once we got rid of the empire, the emperor in Brazil, we had a democracy. There were a relatively republican arrangement going on, more enfranchisement, political inclusion, the opportunity to vote for elected officials. But we also stumbled into a system of government known as colonialismo, or colonialism. This is also sometimes called café con leche, coffee and milk, where local individuals, local party bosses were allowed to control their local votes. They paid people off. They got political favors. They said, we're not going to do this for you unless you vote for us, and we're going to monitor you voting for us because we control also the voting system. So these closed party machines, Tammany Hall in New York City was another example, and we can look throughout the history of the world. Political parties exist in every country to control and monopolize power. In the United States, we have two political parties. They've pretty much monopolize those powers. In Brazil, there's 26, and then also a bunch of independent and other actors who sort of switch around and monopolize power within themselves as politicians. This was a problematic aspect in early Brazil for many reasons, but mostly because individuals, a small number of individuals, were still able to control the vote, and the voter was not allowed to necessarily have a direct say in their vote. And we see one example of this up in the right-hand corner, someone who is marked elector or elector, and then the politico or the politician that is leading him or her by a leash. So the voter is shown as a donkey, and the politician is shown as a normal person. And then we have this sort of symbol, this Colombian symbol of democracy there that is meant to regulate the democratic system. And it's sort of just a farce, right? Then we have right below that, still on the right-hand side, the café con leche system. So when you advance this on the state level, you have all these different political parties, these political interests, and these unseen political forces that are pulling individuals back and forth. So café con leche was more or less a dispute between Sao Paulo and Minas Gerais, two states that are next to each other in Brazil. Minas Gerais was known for its milk and dairy and meat production, and Sao Paulo was known for its coffee production. And they're changing back and forth. These local political bosses were arranging it so those two states really got to switch back and forth between their own political interests, their own politicians that supported their own ideas, and the rest of Brazil. Vast majority of Brazil, the other 80% of Brazil, was unable to have that high-level presidential and federal level representation that those two states were. These were states that were politically organized around coffee and meat production. So people had a lot of influence. Industrialists had a lot of influence. Powerful businessmen had a lot of influence. And they were undoubtedly paying bribes. We also have the dictatorship, which takes various forms in Brazil between the 1930s and the 1980s. But this is one image from, or a political cartoon from the dictatorship. It says, "Lights, camera, action," from the guy sitting in the director's chair. And then next to him, we see the guy say corta, or cut. And that is a political or dictatorship appointed censor that is censoring film. So that was another critique that we see, a different form of corruption. During the dictatorship, they were using force, the physical force of the military and the police, to suppress critique of the government. And of course, these people who were operating without political objection were gaining a whole lot of money and under the table and without the supervision of other democratic bodies and institutions. Fast forward to the modern day, and I'm going to just start off with 2010 about. I'll just sort of generally frame it around there. We see that there's a very specific political context forming in Brazil. We have a long history of a socialist president consolidating power, implementing a series of social programs that are lifting hundreds of thousands and millions of people out of poverty. People are going to university for the first time. Favelas and shantytowns are getting reformed, and they are incredibly popular. It develops into a backlash. This popularity develops into a backlash by individuals in commerce and industry and people who are middle class and upper class and wealthy, who felt like they were being disenfranchised by these programs that were helping the poor and the marginalized. There were several different corruption scandals out of this PT, Partido de Trabalhador, or Workers' Party, that was in power at this time. One, and most likely, arguably, the most influential, was one called Operation Carwash, or Operação Lava Jato. More or less, what was happening was there was a number of projects getting funded, large billion-dollar projects in Brazil at this time by the socialist-leaning government, who was very apt to spend government money during a time of wealth. This was also during an economic boom. 2002 to 2016 was a time of economic prosperity relatively in Brazil. Economic boom, Brazil shot up to be the number 7th largest economy in the world. And one of the principal winners in this was the construction firm Odebrecht. They were nebulous. They had their hands giving money away to anyone who could take it and any politician who would help facilitate and vote in favor of their project. And they were giving anywhere between 1% to 2% of every government-funded project to a politician. So the politician would vote for it, and that money would go to back to the politician, more or less. Okay, politician just got a whole bunch of money, got millions of dollars. How do you hide this money now? You can't do this all in the open. You have to hide this money. It's a crime, what you just did. You're not allowed to vote for a political project, especially in a democracy, if it is directly putting money into your pocket. That's against the law. That is, by definition, a exchange of political favor for money. So how were they hiding this money? They were getting small businesses that were on the side of highways that never operated and saying that they were earning a whole bunch of money every year. One that was the most famous one was a car wash that was on the middle of the highway, was never used, and it was making millions of dollars a year, just a car wash. So federal prosecutors were able to identify this and began to unravel a whole series of crimes that were being committed, financial crimes and money laundering crimes that were taking place by various politicians. And if we look at the comic that is on the screen, we see that there's an oil barrel. So some of the most influential projects that were getting funded and getting money skimmed off the top were associated with Petrobras. They were associated with the National Oil Company. And once investigations started taking place, it turned out that people associated with the the National Oil Company, Oberett, and almost all the major political parties, including the Workers' Party and their opponents, were skimming off the top. And so it resulted in a mass plebiscite, the elimination and the arrest of a number of very important politicians. It also destabilized the Brazilian government and led to the current moment that we are in now, about 5 or 6 years later. Some terms that we can use to really identify this, I like the term lawfare. That's a really good idea. So the idea of using the law to wage a political battle, to disrupt a government, to change and overthrow a government by using its own political mechanisms. No other person represents this better than the attorney, the judge, Sergio Mora. He was a judge in the southern states of Brazil, in the south of Brazil, and he was a relatively unknown politician, political figure. He was a judge. He was remaining relatively low-key until he was empowered. He went and trained in the United States. The U.S. government helped pay for his training, his legal training, in how to root out corruption and find it at the highest level. So he was a U.S. trained lawyer, someone who was empowered by a political and a legal system in Brazil that was very much in support of these attorneys. And he ran the Lava Jato investigation until it was able to ensnare one of the former presidents, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, or Lula, and also Dilma, ensnared them in two different ways. And there's a great documentary about this, what it meant for Brazil as a country and for individuals who supported the socialist government, what it meant for them, named The Edge of Democracy. It was nominated for an Oscar, and I'll refer to that in terms of how this played out, because I think it did a very excellent job of personalizing the events that took place in using the idea of corruption to overthrow politicians who might not have even committed crimes, but were nonetheless held responsible for an overall corrupt system. So eventually, Lula goes to jail and Dilma gets impeached. So his successor, his follow-up, the first woman president of Brazil, who was tortured by the dictatorship, who was a communist revolutionary and tortured and arrested by the dictatorship, she ends up getting voted out of power for being culpable for the negligence of her government. And it leads to a quick succession of more economically conservative politicians who are much more in favor of the idea of law and order, of getting rid of social programs, and of empowering business people to enrich themselves. Looking at the current presidency, Jair Bolsonaro, we can see that corruption is very much identifiable in the form of nepotism. It's a very specific form of corruption where you use your political position to enrich your family and concentrate power in your family. Here we have the three oldest sons of Jair Bolsonaro, os filhos Bolsonaro. They are all incredibly powerful people in their own right. They're all in their 30s, and they have been powerful most of their adult life. From left to right, we have Carlos. He is a 37-year-old alderman of Rio de Janeiro. He's been an alderman since he was 18 years old. We'll talk about an example of very problematic political corruption that he took part in just here in a moment. We have Eduardo, who is a federal police officer. He is also a national deputy as of 2015. And he is a media personality aligned with Steve Bannon, who is also a campaign advisor for Donald Trump, and a number of white nationalist media groups that are based in Europe. So he is seeing himself as not only a nationalist, but someone who is law and order. He's a police officer, so he's going around, a media personality, going on news shows, advocating for Bandido Bome, Bandido Morto, these type of things. And then we have Flavio, who's a senator, and we'll talk about him as well in a second. But Flavio is no slough himself. Being a senator is a pretty prestigious position, and he has ensnared himself in some forms of corruption as well. And with ensnaring these three guys, these three stooges, in corruption plots, we see that Jair Bolsonaro is also being ensnared himself. So the president of Brazil is also being implicated in the corruption racket that his sons and his family member and his associates are responsible for. One of the more tragic cases of corruption to come out of Brazil in the last 5 years is that of Marielle Franco, who was a older woman from the favelas of Rio de Janeiro, from Maré. She is someone who identifies as LGBTQ. She identifies as Afro-Brazilian. She identifies as someone who's poor, someone who was there to stick up for the rights of the marginalized. And if we can think about law and order and the idea of normalcy and the idea of deviance, the person who threatens normalcy, who supports the people who are declared to be deviants, that person is going to get the force of the state against them in some way. Unfortunately for Marielle, that came in the point of assassination. One morning or one afternoon, she was leaving the city hall, the chamber of older people in Rio, and her driver were gunned down. It was instantly known that it was a police operation, or someone associated with the police, or someone associated with the militias, which are a form of mafia type organization in Brazil that's not necessarily drug gangs. They're often associated and work alongside corrupt police and pay them off, and they run protection rackets. So they go around and shake down local businesses to give them money to keep out other riffraff, right? So they're added protection on top of the police, which the police are in. After a short investigation, it turns out that it was Rony Lessa and Elcio Vera de Carlos. Okay, this is these guys are two police officers, ex-police officers. They are people strongly associated with militias, and they are also strongly associated with a lot of the political functions of the Bolsonaro political machine, and a lot of individuals who were really close to Bolsonaro. People that have shared jobs, and he's given jobs to individuals. And he's also been aligned, and this is Carlos Bolsonaro specifically. We see that Carlos Bolsonaro was close associates with these individuals. And there was an element of Carlos's assistants borrowing cars to the individuals who took part in the assassination, and there's a missing person that they can't identify. It's a very sloppy case. But what we see is that there appears to be a loose connection, but nonetheless something that could be very easily connected, that Marielle's constant critique of the Bolsonaros, of the get tough on crime discourse, caused her to be a target for the very crime that she was critiquing, which was pretty much the unnecessary death by the hands of police and militias that was taking place. So we see that there's a lot of different discourses going on here, and we can see that there was a political action being taken. This death was political. This was a deed that was undertaken in order to support a specific political group of individuals. Now, there's no official proof that Carlos or Jair ordered the assassination, but we can make the connection that these individuals who had profited from their relationship to the Bolsonaros, to their relationship with militias. There's some photo here in the left-hand corner with Jair Bolsonaro and one of the people that have been accused of killing Marielle. We can see that these connections and these intimate relationships can't be ignored. They were probably consequential in how Marielle was assassinated. That's one huge form of corruption. Another form of corruption to come out of the Bolsonaro family. And there's other examples, but these are probably the two most noteworthy. We have Fabricio, another son of Jair Bolsonaro. His driver, his head of security, was found to be shifting around 1.2 million reais, or $300,000, to the account of Jair Bolsonaro. At the time, Fabricio Carlos was living in a very modest house, supposedly. He was driving an old car, and there would be no way that he would be just giving or borrowing $300,000. This was something that was beyond normal for investigators. Find this out, there's this huge, big anti-corruption investigation going on. It is operating under the assumption that a rachadinha was performed. This is a specific crime. I have it here on the screen. The rachadinha is when you pay someone to work for you. You get political money to get someone to work for you. And that person turns around, that employee turns around and then pays you a part of their salary. So more or less, that person who is giving the job is benefiting from money that was meant to be spent to help facilitate a political or a governmental endeavor, but not necessarily to enrich someone personally. This is a form of corruption, of self-enrichment through political office, using political funds to enrich oneself. There's also a sort of added wrinkle to this story that was crazy. And here we have, I just want to point to some of the images here before I go on to that. We can see Fabricio and Carlos sitting next to each other at the same table. Another example, Carlos, Fabricio, and the president, Jair Bolsonaro, are all sharing a meal. They're all supposed to be long-term acquaintances, right? They've been friends for a long time. More or less, the Bolsonaro family gave this old family friend a really lucrative job, was getting a whole bunch of money, and there's sort of some assumptions that there was some corrupt payments, bribes getting filtered through Carlos, and that was going to the accounts of the First Lady and the First Lady's family, and that was being a form of laundering money, playing the shell game, right? Putting that money in so many different places that it becomes really difficult to track down in terms of accounting. One of the other wrinkles then, and we see here a meme, this is probably the new political cartoon that is coming out of modern internet society. The meme, there was a meme that was produced along the way in this investigation of Fabrice of Flavio being dressed like Willy Wonka. So why is this happening? Well, it turns out that Flavio and members of his family owned part of a chocolate store in a very prominent shopping in Rio de Janeiro. And this chocolate store was the most profitable chocolate store in Brazil by far. The money going in, people are buying Easter eggs for like exorbitant amounts of money, and it was all going towards Flavio. They also found out that the military police, the same people who were helping to organize political and institutional support for the president, whose son, if we remember, there is Eduardo, who is a military police person, works for them, and they have dramatic support, fundamental support in the police force because they're law and order people. Those individuals spent tens of thousands of dollars at the chocolate store. The police union and military police accounted for tens of thousands of dollars of chocolate purchases at this chocolate store. And well, you can argue, people like chocolate, they came to mind because they like me, all that kind of stuff. But it was just too much money, far too much money. Millions of dollars, $1.2 million that was going towards, or a million reais that was going towards this chocolate shop. Fundamental, something's fishy there. Fast forward to early 2020, the investigation is suspended by none other than the same Justice Department that is now led by Attorney General Sergio Moro, the same person who prosecuted the Lava Jato case against the socialist president, against the presidency and the political parties that were the enemies of the Bolsonaros. So we can see within itself forms of political and institutional corruption happening, people serving themselves, running political operations to empower themselves through different political institutions. Money's changing hand, authority's changing hand, political titles are changing hands, and it's pretty sloppy. It's morally ambiguous. It's very difficult to really splice this out. So in conclusion, how can we describe corruption in Brazil? Corruption is an everyday occurrence. It is not just something that is a big level, but something that takes place in chocolate stores, something that takes place with nobodies who don't have any political power, but they're there to just launder and milk money. It's people on the corner store in the favela that has to pay a bribe to a militia that is also paying a bribe to a politician. It is something that is diffuse and can be found in almost every interaction in everyday settings. We can look at the rationalities. There's very different rationalities that we can see getting explained. What's a good and proper way to have a government? What's a bad way to have a government? We can see different political actors enacting different political authorities. In deciding that, we can see that there's different sets of moralities. We can see that it's okay for some people to shift around millions and millions of dollars with not having too much transparency, not having too much accountability. And we can see that some people have so much political power that they can just end investigations into them. So we can also look at the practices of corruption. We can look at the ways that it manifests in its events, in its consequences, in its institutional forms, the type of social networks that get created based off of it. And then we can look at it in terms of cultural relativity, a global feature. These crimes that are committed in Brazil are similar to crimes that have been committed in every other country in the world. And then we can see that there is a normalization of white-collar crime as a consequence of all these investigations. A normal person would probably go to jail for a long time. A person with a great deal of power already has that political authority to evade and rearrange political institutions to protect themselves. Thank you for listening. I will definitely respond to any questions you have over email or any other issues you have. I'm going to update this over time. This is definitely a specific set of examples. We can talk about this endlessly. We could have a whole course about this, not just one lecture, but we could have a whole course about corruption. And I'll encourage you to look at the links that I'm going to be posting along with this video, along with this lecture, to give you more detailed interpretations. Once again, this is Dr. J, and thank you for listening.